Chapter 11. Trouble Spots. As soon as Crystal had washed her dishes and disappeared into the bathroom, Nikki raced upstairs. She hooked Otis to his leash and flew down the stairs again. She tiptoed past Crystal's room, where she heard the roar of the hairdryer, and zipped out the back door. At the far end of the garden, she looped Otis's leash around the trunk of a tree.
"Now, Otis," she said, "try to be quiet. I'll come back for you as soon as I can."
Inside again, past Crystal's room, this time she heard the psst psst of the hairspray, and up the stairs to the nursery. She hid the dog dishes and the dog food in a box of old toys in the closet, tore down the blanket that they'd hung over the door, and then came Crystal's steps on the stairs, and her voice calling, "Are you up there?" Nikki showed her the two storage rooms first. "Oh, horrors!" said Crystal, looking at the cobwebby trunks and boxes and suitcases. "It's true that they never threw anything away. Just looking at it gives me a headache." She went toward the nursery. "What's in here?"
"I've been sort of staying in here,"
Nikki said. Crystal strode in. She gazed at the rugs, the blankets hung on the walls, the rocking chair and lamps.
"I did it,"
Nikki said.
"I wanted to make it cozy."
Crystal smiled at her. "Well, it is cozy," she said. "It's actually quite a nice room. It smells a little funny, though." She wrinkled her nose. "Probably there are rats up under the roof. Let's let some air in." She went to the window and thrust it open. The sound of barking and whining floated up from below, but Crystal paid no attention. "When we get ready to put the house on the market," she said, "we can sell this as a perfect space for a home gym, or maybe a media center. Screen over there." She raised her hands, measuring a wall-sized screen. "Theater seats here. Could be quite lovely. What do you think?" But she didn't pause to hear what Nikki thought, which was that she didn't like any of those ideas. She went right on to say that she would decide what to do about all this later. But today, since it was Sunday and she couldn't do much shopping, she was going to take a drive with Len. "I don't suppose you want to come," she said.
"Who's Len?"
said Nikki. "The real estate agent."
"Oh,"
said Nikki.
"No, I don't want to come."
Once Crystal had left, Nikki rescued Otis from the back garden and played with him a long time to make up for his exile. The shoe they'd been using for a toy had turned into a shapeless wad by now, so Nikki found an ancient yellow tennis ball in the closet. Otis adored it. He had to stretch his jaws wide apart to hold it, which made him look as if he were trying to swallow a grapefruit. When Otis lost interest in chasing the ball and settled down to gnaw on it, Nikki decided that today would be her day to explore Yonwood. It was going to be her home, after all, if she accomplished her goal number 1. And while she was at it, she would keep her eyes open for sinners and trouble spots, and anything that had a feeling of wrongness. If she was going to accomplish goal number 3, she needed to understand all this. She would keep her eyes open for Martin, too. She might happen to run into him somewhere, and they might happen to talk to each other. She needed to find out if he was someone she could fall in love with, goal number 2. So far, she couldn't tell. He was nice-looking. He was friendly, sort of. That was enough for a start. She walked to the upper end of Main Street, where the school was, empty today because it was Sunday. Though it was still cold and windy, the sun was out. Some boys were shooting baskets in the schoolyard. She looked to see if Martin was one of them, but he was not. A few blocks farther on, and she was in downtown Yonwood. A few stores were open, but their lights were still off. They looked uninviting, like dim caves. Small clusters of people gathered in places where a TV was on, showing the news. Nikki heard snippets as she passed. 5 days remaining until the deadline, said the president's voice from the Cozy Corner Cafe. Ambassador has been assassinated, he said from the newsstand. Group calling itself the Warriors of God has claimed, he said from the drugstore. The familiar nervous feeling started up in Nikki's stomach as she heard these words, and she could tell that the other people were nervous too. A woman behind her was talking about how the tension was just killing her, and another woman answered that it was killing her too, but that they had to have faith, that they'd be all right. And the first person said yes, she did believe that, but she was just wishing everyone did. Nikki hurried on, not wanting to hear any more. Half a block down, she suddenly heard the strange hum she'd heard before. Mmm. Where was it coming from? A machine inside a building? Some kind of car or engine on the street? She looked around but saw nothing. The hum grew slightly louder. Was it behind the grocery store? She peered up a narrow alley and thought she saw someone darting across the other end. But she wasn't sure. The hum faded. Nikki turned around. Behind her were two of the people who'd been watching the president at the drugstore a minute ago. A short, bald man and a gray-haired woman.
"Did you hear that funny sound?"
she said.
"Do you know what it was?"
Neither one answered. They kept on walking. The man cast a suspicious glance at her, and the woman pressed her lips together and shook her head.
"I just wondered,"
Nikki said. The woman stopped and glared at her.
"You should know," she said. "Why don't you know? Whose child are you?"
But she didn't wait for an answer. She reached for the man's arm, and they hastened away. Nikki felt as if she'd been slapped. She wasn't supposed to ask about the hum, that was clear. But why not? How was she supposed to find out if she didn't ask? She went on. Toward the end of Main Street, she came to the grocery store. And beyond that was the church she'd seen when she and Crystal had first arrived. The Church of the Fiery Vision, the sign said, but she could also make out the old name that had been crossed out. Yonwood Community Church. Today the sign also said, Today's Sermon, Pulling Together in Dark Times. A lot of people were gathered here, milling about and greeting one another in low voices. Many of them were wearing the round blue buttons she'd first seen on Mrs. Beeson. The doors of the church stood open, and beside them was a thin-faced man dressed in a sort of robe, dark blue with a white border. Was that the Reverend Loomis? Nikki wondered. She saw Mrs. Beeson standing near him, though she almost didn't recognize her at first, because Mrs. Beeson was wearing a woolly gray hat like an upside-down bowl, and her gray hair was brushed and fluffy instead of in a ponytail. She spoke to all the people as they went inside. Nikki waved to her, and Mrs. Beeson flashed her a smile. Nikki turned around and walked back the way she'd come, but on the other side of the street this time. She noticed a few things that might be examples of wrongness. By the park, she saw an old man spitting on the sidewalk. Surely that was a wrong thing to do. She also saw an angry little boy pulling a cat's tail. She told him not to, and he scowled at her. It was wicked to hurt animals, but was it wicked if a 6-year-old did it? She wasn't sure. In an alley beside the boarded-up movie theater, she saw 3 teenage girls smoking. She wasn't sure about that one either. Was it bad to smoke? Or only bad before a certain age? She would ask Mrs. Beeson. For a few minutes, she followed along behind a group of kids to see if they were being cruel to each other, the way kids sometimes were. She saw some teasing and a little roughhousing, but nothing much. She looked for Martin in this group, but he wasn't there. When she was back where she had started, at the north end of Main Street, she headed downhill. The houses were farther apart here than in Greenhaven's neighborhood, and smaller. She saw a woman sitting on her front porch, reading the paper. A few children played ball in the street. No one was doing anything wrong, as far as she could tell. Really, Yonwood seemed like a very good town. So much better than dirty, crime-riddled Philadelphia. Following the words of the prophet must be working. Farther on, she came to what looked at first like a big, wild, vacant lot. A high fence ran alongside it, and beyond the fence grew tall, unkempt trees. After 100 yards or so, she came to a gravel drive with a mailbox beside it. H. McCoy, 600 Raven Road, was printed in black paint on the mailbox, and a no trespassing sign was nailed to a tree. She recognized the name McCoy. Mrs. Beeson had mentioned this person. He was the one she was worried about for some reason. She peered up the driveway. At the end, rising from a tangle of trees and rangy shrubs, she could just glimpse the peak of a roof. Tree branches threw shadows across it, and the shadows danced in the wind like long, thin ghosts. Should she go in there and see what H. McCoy was up to? Not today, she thought. Some other time. She walked on. A block or so farther on, an alley led off Raven Road. Really more of a wide path, rutted and unpaved. It went behind the houses on Trillium Street. Curious, Nikki turned that way. From the alley she could see into backyards. Most of them were empty and quiet. At one house she heard loud voices through an open window. She paused a moment to listen. The people inside were insulting each other and swearing. Surely that was bad. Did it mean they counted as sinners? At the next house, a wire fence bordered the alley. Beyond the fence, she could see the gnarled bare branches of fruit trees, and beyond those, the back of a house that badly needed a coat of paint. Just inside the fence, so close to the alley that she could have touched it if she'd wanted to, stood a shed made of weather-worn planks. At this place, there was a lot going on. 2 small children charged around among the tree trunks, yelling at each other. One of them had a toy truck that the other seemed to want, and he chased his brother wildly, falling down on skids of slippery leaves, shrieking the whole time. A window in the back of the house opened, and an old woman stuck her head out and cried, "You kids, quit that!" But the kids paid no attention. Nikki watched them, peeking out from behind the shed so she wouldn't be noticed. The shrieking boy finally grabbed the truck away from the other boy, and that boy wailed furiously. Another child appeared, a girl maybe 4 or 5 years old, and scolded the boy who was crying. And then a bigger boy, closer to Nikki's age, burst out the back door. He had curly blonde hair, big ears, and a strong, skinny body. The boy leapt down the porch steps. "Hey, Roddy, lost your truck?" he called. "Want an airplane instead?" And he took hold of the little boy's hands and whirled him around so that he flew off the ground, squealing with laughter. "Fly me," said the other boy, and the big boy did. He flew the girl, too. Then he said, "Now, all of you quit making such a racket. There's plenty of toys inside. Go on." "But I want," the little boy started to wail. "Go on," said the big boy, "and leave me alone." Nikki expected that he'd disappear back into the house, but instead he came toward the shed at the end of the yard. She ducked down quickly. He fiddled with the door for a moment. Maybe it was locked. She couldn't see. And then opened it and went inside. Nikki should probably have left at this point. She had no reason to think this was a trouble spot. But as usual, curiosity took hold of her. What was the boy doing in this falling down shed? Because the shed backed up against the fence, and because there was a dusty window in the back of the shed, just the right height for looking into, she might be able to see in without being noticed. She put her eye to the glass.